Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's tutorial, we will learn how to create a cross-stitch app using JavaScript. There are three inputs: height, where the user can specify the grid height. Similar to height, we have a width input. After that, we have a color picker input field, where the user can select a color for the grid tiles. Now coming to buttons, we have three buttons. The first one is to create the grid of desired size. The next one is to save the image that is created using this app. This uses HTML to Canvas library. And lastly, we have a clear button that clears the entire grid by removing any markings from the tiles. As you can see, there has been an image that has been downloaded. This is in PNG format, and this is the exact replica of the grid that we have created here. Now we clear the grid and let's start with the tutorial. We start with the HTML code. We have a div element with a class wrapper. This acts as the main container for our app's content. Inside the wrapper div, we have two main sections: inputs and buttons. The input section contains three input wrappers div. Each input wrapper represents an input field for the user to provide information. The first input field is for the height of the grid. It's a number input field with the ID height input. The min attribute is set to 1, which means the minimum value the user can enter is 1. The max attribute is set to 20, limiting the user's input range to a maximum of 20. The initial value of this input field is set to 10. Now, the second input is for the width of the grid. It is similar to the height input with the ID width input. The minimum and maximum values are also set to 1 and 20 respectively. The initial value is set to 10 as well. We set the for attribute of the label to the ID of the input tag to link the label to its corresponding input. Here it is important that you mention the proper ID. Now, the third input is a color picker input field with the ID color input. It allows users to select a color for the grid tiles. The initial value is set to black. Now, once we are done with the input section, let us move to the buttons section. We have three buttons. The first button has the ID create grid and is labeled create grid. When this button is clicked, it triggers the creation of grid based on the provided height and width values. The second button with the ID save button is labeled as save image. Clicking the button will convert the grid into an image and allow the users to save it. The third button with the ID clear button is labeled as clear. Clicking this button will clear the grid by removing any markings or content from the grid tiles. After the buttons, we have a P element with the ID error message. This element will be used to display an error message if the user tries to enter a height or width greater than 20. Finally, we have a container div that holds the grid. Inside the container, we have a div element with the ID grid. Now let us move to the CSS. First, we have a block of universal CSS rules denoted by the asterisk. This rule sets the margin and padding to 0 for all the elements. Apply border box to the box sizing property and set the font family to Poppins, which is a common sans serif font. Moving on, we set the background color of the body to a vibrant yellow. The next rule targets the wrapper class. It sets a fixed width of 600 pixels, a white background color, and positions it absolutely in the center of the screen using the transform property along with top and left property. Once the wrapper is centered, we add some padding and give it a rounded border with a border radius of 1 em. The container class is styled with a margin of 2 em on top and bottom and auto on left and right. The margin on left and right is for centering and its child elements are centered using the place items property. The inputs class uses flexbox to arrange its child elements in a row with a gap of 1 em between them. The label selector is set to display as a block which ensures each label appears on a new line. The input type color selector customizes the appearance of color picker input fields. It removes the default styling, makes the background transparent, and sets the width and height to specific values. For WebKit and Mozilla browsers, there are additional rules to style the color swatch of the color picker, giving it a round border and a subtle gray border. To see the style input properly, let me disable this Chrome extension that I use, and after refreshing you can see this properly. The input type number selector sets some padding, border radius and border styles for the number input fields. The buttons class adds a top margin of 1 em to create some space between the buttons and other elements. The create grid button, identified by its ID, has a background color matching to the body background color and a text color of slightly bluish black. This creates a contrasting look. Both the buttons and links have a similar styles defined. They have a font size of 0.8 em, some padding, a border radius, a white background, a 2px solid border, and a text color matching the border color. Additionally, the outline is set to none, removing the default focus outline. The grid ID styles the grid container. It has a zero grid gap and is displayed as an inline grid, which ensures the grid items are arranged in a row. Now let us move on to JavaScript. But before we move to JavaScript, let me add some styling to the tiles. So I have misplaced some code of the tiles into the grid. Let me go and fix that. Each tile inside the grid is represented by the tile class. It has a fixed height and width of 20 pixels. First, we have a series of variable declarations where we grab references to various elements in the HTML using the document.getElementById and document.querySelector methods. These elements include the height input, color input, clear button, create button, etc. Now we go back to CSS and style the tile. We set the border to 1px solid. We set the font family to Carla. We have chosen this font to ensure that the markings on the tile are bold and specific. We also use the font weight of 700 so that the markings are more bold and specific, they stand out. We make sure that the X markings are centered horizontally and vertically by using the display flex layout along with align items and justify content, both set to center. Now let's go back to JavaScript. Next, we create the variable declarations For width input, color input, save button, error message, create button, grid container, etc. Next, we have a variable current color declared without any initial value. This variable will be used to store the currently selected color by the user. Now, let's move on to the event listeners. The first event listener is attached to the color input. It listens for the input event which triggers whenever the user changes the color in the color input. When this event occurs, the code inside the event listener assigns the current color value to the current color variable. Next, we define a function called createGrid, which will be responsible for creating the grid based on the user's input. It starts by clearing any error messages and content of the grid container. Then it retrieves the value of the height and width inputs, parsing them into integers or defaulting to 10 if no values are provided. If either the height or width is greater than 20, it displays an error message and the function returns early. The grid container style is then updated using CSS grid to set the number of columns based on the width provided by the user. A loop is then used to create a grid boxes or tiles based on the calculated height and width. Each tile is represented by a div element with the class tile. When a tile is clicked, it toggles the color of the text inside it to the current color selected by the user, effectively coloring the tile. If the tile contains an X character, it clears the text. Otherwise, it adds an X. Next, we have a function called clear grid, which clears the content of all the tiles in the grid. It does so by selecting all the elements with the tile class and setting their inner text to an empty string. Let us first check if the toggling function is working properly before proceeding to clear grid. Now let us proceed to clear grid. The save button event listener listens for a click on the save button. When clicked, it uses the HTML to canvas library to convert the grid or the cross stitch pattern into a canvas element. Then it converts the canvas content to a data URL. A temporary download link is created using the data URL and it is triggered programmatically to save the image as image.png. The temporary download link is then removed. As you can see here, something is not working. Let us inspect. On inspecting, we can see that HTML to canvas is not defined. This is probably because we haven't added the CDN to HTML to canvas library. Let us search HTML to canvas CDN. Go to the first link. Copy the URL. Go back to the HTML code and paste it inside the script tag. Finally, the window onload event listener is used to set some initial values and call the create grid function when the page loads. It ensures that the initial grid is displayed when the page is opened, and it sets the default color to black in the color input. Let us check if all the functions work by creating some random picture. Let me go ahead and save this image. This image looks good enough. Let us clear the grid. Let us try to change the height and width of the grid. Once again, let's draw some random pattern. So that's it for this tutorial. If you like this tutorial, please click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more such tutorials. I'll be back with more such coding tutorials. Till then, happy coding.